Yeah, I think you're right. Where's that? No. Did you hear it's going to be Todd and
I did, yes, I saw your note last time.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's good, Todd was as involved as anyone, so.
Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, especially when we started putting pen to paper and really digging in, he was extremely involved, so.
That's
And
good.
I mean, he's really knowledgeable and great anyways, so it doesn't matter.
Good. I don't know I'm allowed for that.
You don't know?
I think I will know once I see him. I'm not sure I'm feeling this directly.
Yeah, I mean, he's a very good shot.
Good. All right. No. You're on the live stream already, you know.
Okay, great.
It's actually good. Because it's funny, there's people stream people, they're very attentive. You know,
Sure.
like I hear
Yeah. Those are waters I just grabbed.
I
So.
didn't, I didn't realize until I talked to Michael that, hey, last time we were going to get school. Yeah. That's,
2 hours plus. Yep.
oh, wow. That's gonna be dreary, isn't it?
Good thing we get paid to talk about, right?
My gosh, I feel bad for the
me, it wouldn't be more like a 2 to 3.
How's your summer been?
Good, how about
Yeah.
yours? You know,
Just in the gym, I mean, just a ton of stuff with all the solar makings and everything. It's just, it's a lot.
I'm a little embarrassed. RPS came and went and didn't even.
Well, comments are due today. The second round of comments, I should say.
Looking pretty good though.
I think so. I mean, they had commission staff and a few, I think, very legitimate concerns about how to address some things, like existing contracts, and they just re-up and ignore the new RPS, or must, if they're re-upping on the exact same terms, can they just do that, or are they required to prove them with new supply?
Hey, how are you? Good to see you.
Very glad we're not doing 7-minute remarks from the road. I was originally told,
Yeah, I was
Yeah,
thinking about it, I just, it makes
yeah.
sense, I mean, this sometimes just gonna work out.
Sounds good.
How's the house?
We just moved in like a week and a half ago.
Right. So we are live streaming.
Pull over.
the empty spot.
Oh, did you have some of those?
We did two.
Yeah.
They couldn't be delivered at the same time, so we could hold that.
What's baby doing in a minute?
Baby's due right in less than 10 days. So my phone's on, so if you see me run away,
Not because of what we said?
maybe, but
live streaming, as Jeremy pointed out to me.
Sounds good. Always.
That's actually true.
That's okay. Thank you so much. So it's pretty, it's forward and then it's back. So it's just like, oh, and I'm doing this stupid thing where I point at the screen, but of course I have to do it that way.
Okay.
So that's, I want to show the other sponsors anyway, so it works. So it's just, that's back,
Okay.
so forward,
And
back.
do you know if is there a light?
A
Shooter?
laser?
Laser? I don't see one.
Not that I'm aware of, I'm
Okay.
afraid.
It's okay.
I'll ask, after I do my little intro spiel.
You'd have to see it. It would be right in
Yeah,
there.
there
Okay.
is. So,
Okay. That's pretty straightforward.
yeah.
Hey, I just want to maybe I should tell him, I have to cut out early because I have to take my mother to the doctor's appointment. She's having surgery, so like 9:15.
Oh, okay.
9:20.
We'll go to you.
Is that all right?
We'll make it work. Good morning. Recharged. Woohoo! What a morning. Those of you who have worked on events like this know these kinds of programs don't just come together. And I want to start out by thanking the members of the E2 Tech Program Committee, particularly Sarah Tracy and Brooke Barnes, for all you do. Thank you so much. And I hope everyone had a chance to meet Adelaide Taylor, our new program administrator, when you checked in. I can tell you that we would not be able to pull basically anything E2 Tech does off without Adelaide. I think she's still out there, but thank you to Adelaide as well. Okay. Now, let's talk sponsors. E2 Tech is a membership-driven organization, and we're blessed to have some great supporters and sponsors. Today, our gold sponsor is Pierce Atwood, and Barry Dunn, New England Clean Energy Connect, Stantec, and Revision Energy have also given us very strong support for this program, along with this group here, and we would not be here without them. I do want to highlight a couple of organizations up here in particular, if I can. Notably, on the lower left, the Northeast Clean Energy Council. So this is the group that pulls together E2 Tech-like organizations across New England, and they have funded this program specifically. As a matter of fact, Dan Bosley from NECEC, are you here? So we welcome Dan this morning. He served 22 years in the Massachusetts State Legislature. So I think that's sainthood. Speaking of legislators, are there members of the Maine legislature here? Would you raise your hand? I want to thank you all so much for coming. I know what a commitment it is. It's really meaningful to us as a group to have you, members of the Maine legislature, the lawmakers, the policymakers here, and I hope you can stand us being up here critiquing your work. There are a lot of benefits to being an E2 Tech member, and these leading organizations have chosen to join at our highest level, and I hope you'll consider doing that as well. And we're really blessed to have such a wide range of support. And one of the big member benefits that I'm pleased to be rolling out is member logos. And so these are great for your website or other social media or anything like that to show you're a member of E2 Tech. So lastly, if you are pursuing continuing CLE credits today, make sure you sign in at the registration desk. We need to have you sign in for your CLEs. All of our speakers get copies of the Sunrise Guide, which is a nice partnership that we have. If we see you consulting it during the program, that's not a good look, but please take it with you. And my final ask is tag us on social media. It really helps us, and we greatly appreciate it. And that's it from me. I hope you're recharged, and I know we have a great program ahead. Mr. Michael Stoddard.
Good morning. Thanks, Marty. And thanks, everyone, for coming out this morning. Really appreciate it. We are excited to have this great panel here and to look back at a little bit of what transpired at the legislature this past year, and it was really momentous, but especially to talk about looking forward and where we think it's going to go from here, what some of the next steps are, what the significance is, what are some of the keys to success, and hopefully we'll do that with enough time to allow a lot of questions from the audience. So as you're listening along, be thinking of a pithy question. Jim Lebrecht, I saw you here, and pithy means something like a minute or less. But I know you'll ask a good question, so I'm looking forward to it. I will quickly do introductions, but I'm not going to belabor the point, and I will rely on these panelists to weave into their responses important parts of their job or their background if it's critical. But Beth Ahern is from the Maine Conservation Voters. Dan Burgess we have from the Governor's Energy Office, the Director of the Governor's Energy Office. Todd Grissett is a partner at Preddy Flaherty and is a last-minute pinch hitter for his colleague Steve Hudson, who was called away on other matters this morning. Jim Mitchell from Mitchell Tardy Jackson is a regular advocate appearing before the Energy and Utilities Committee, as are all these panelists. And Jeremy Payne is at the Maine Renewable Energy Association. I am the director of the Efficiency Maine Trust. It's my great privilege to do that work and also to work with these folks on a regular basis. The legislature usually meets starting in January and goes through June in a long session like we had last year. So we all get to know each other fairly well in those meetings in the hallways and in the committee rooms. And we spend a lot of time thinking about what goes into these bills that sometimes become laws. So it's going to be very interesting, I think, to hear what people's perspectives were on how that process worked and what some of the issues were and where we go from here. So without further ado, I'm going to launch in because we have a lot of ground to cover. We started planning for this forum a couple months ago, and we made a laundry list of all the bills that passed. And it was incredible how many there were. And we sorted them and screened them and poked and prodded at them, thinking about how we could get it down to a manageable number to talk about today. And so I just want to start by saying this is not every bill that passed in the Energy, Utilities, and Technology Committee. And I should even further note that there are other bills that relate to energy that may have been addressed in some other committees that may not be mentioned here either. So this is not exhaustive by any means. But we did feel like this covered the waterfront. This gave a good representation, certainly of some of the most significant bills, and also a good variety. after we got that list down to what we thought might be a manageable number, we started thinking about how we would talk about them. And we kind of came up with this table to sort them out. And then we're going to run this panel this morning consistent with this sequence. So we're going to go left to right. I'm going to start you out with a quick reference to LD 1679, which is the bill that established the Maine Climate Council and some very significant greenhouse gas reduction targets, because that's kind of the big picture, and everything else that we'll talk about will be contributing towards meeting those goals. And but I think it's helpful to have that in mind as we go through. Some of these bills are about energy supply, where it comes from, what kind it is, where our electricity comes from, what are the rules about that, and the policies that impact where our power and our other energy comes from and how clean it is. A second category is the grid. So especially, obviously, anytime we're talking about electricity, it's got to get from point A to point B. In many cases, it's made at a central power generator that is not located near where the end user is and has to travel across the wires to get there. And there are policies around how that grid is paid for and managed that will impact what kind of energy supply we're able to use, and then as end users, what comes to us and what we pay for it. And so then at the other end of the spectrum, we have the end users, and so we had a category of bills here about making the end use equipment, the lights and the appliances and the machinery that we have and the homes and buildings that we build cleaner or more efficient. And then finally, there was kind of a catch-all category of studies. Sometimes these are purposely designed to be studies from the outset, and other times they are bills that didn't quite have enough oomph to get across the finish line, and people felt they needed more information, and so the legislature directs a study to be done and bring the information back later. So these are the categories we're going to march through this morning, and that's the best we could come up with for an organizing principle. So we'll see how it goes. So first on the list, I wanted to just reference this big picture framework to keep in mind. LD 1679 was enacted to establish the Maine Climate Change Council and to assist Maine to mitigate, prepare for, and adapt to climate change. Two of the bigger takeaway points from this bill are that it sets a required greenhouse gas reductions over three time frames, but I'll just talk about the 2030 time frame. We're seeking to get a 45% reduction in greenhouse gases from 1990 levels, and by 2050 to achieve a 80% reduction from 1990 levels. And those are the same basic targets that you see in all the international target setting and the national target setting when it's typically talked about. So that puts Maine right on track to be in line with what scientists are saying is needed in order to mitigate the worst, the risks of climate change. So if I could have, I would have just eliminated that bar on the right, because that's the United States averages by sector. And I realize that the print is too small and you can't see it, but I'll just tell you that left column is where the greenhouse gases are coming from for Maine. That's Maine's emissions profile. And the bottom bar, the blue bar, 54%, is transportation. So 54% of our greenhouse gases are coming from transportation. 9% is the next above it in orange, and that's electric power generation. 18% in the gray chunk is residential use, consumption at our homes around Maine. And then the top two are commercial, and then industrial in gold at the top at 9%. So there's nothing magic about that. It just tells us at the outset where we need to be looking if we're going to try and achieve 45% emissions reductions, and then 80% emissions reductions. These are the places we have to pull from to try and get those numbers down. So I thought that would be useful context. Before I go on, I thought I'd take 1 second and ask Dan to quickly tell us a little, infomercial public service announcement about next steps, because I do believe there's some newsworthy information about where that bill is going next.
That's right. So, is this on?
Yes, it is.
Great. Folks may have seen the governor at the United Nations this week. So that really builds on a lot of the work that's happening here with the Maine Climate Council. We have a kickoff tomorrow. The Climate Council itself is made up of about 35 members. And then there will be 6 to 7 different working groups within that Climate Council. In particular, there's going to be a working group on energy, transportation, buildings, working lands, public health, all these issues that climate change can touch. And we're going to kick this work off tomorrow. I think it's important to note that tomorrow is just the kickoff and we're going to have a broad public engagement process, so don't see tomorrow as anything but a kickoff. We're excited to have kind of all the ideas that are in this room and across the state, bringing the best ideas together, really making these working groups kind of the laboratories where we can bring the best ideas together to figure out how to tackle climate change. The end product will be a climate action plan due December of 2020, and that will be updated at 4 years every year thereafter. And then with the governor's executive order that she issued this week, we'll also be looking at how to ensure that Maine is carbon neutral. So we'll be taking a look at our working forests and soils and other ways to sequester carbon. So it's going to be an exciting process, and hope you will all take part. I should note we had a couple of representatives come in, so just want to acknowledge Rep. Rikerson, Hanley, Representative Berry, Tina Riley, and Senator Vitelli. And I've also seen staff from the Senate President's Office. And none of this work that we're talking about today would be possible without their work. So I want to recognize them as well.
Thanks, Dan. So I do hope folks in the audience who care deeply about these issues will, I hope this will get your juices flowing. You'll start thinking about ways that you could contribute to that process, because there will be a public input component of it. And I think folks with good ideas, whether it's policy ideas or program ideas, or just how to educate our fellow citizens and other constituents in the state to build support for the ideas that come out of this planning process, will get engaged and consider this an opportunity to get motivated to get out there. So let's jump in. I have 2 slides on the cleaner supply component of the bills, and I tried to get it down to 1, but I just couldn't do it, and that's because this damn bill is so big, and there's so much in it. This is the Renewable Portfolio Supply legislation, LD 1494. I'll touch on the highlights, and then I'm going to ask the panel to fill in some of the details. So it calls for Maine to get 80% of its electricity supply from renewable electricity, and a particular definition for what would qualify to meet that of Class 1 renewable energy. And then to eventually reach 100% by 2050. One of the changes in the law was to allow, as eligible for meeting that, solar installations that exceed 100 megawatts in size. It also introduced a somewhat novel concept, at least for Maine, of having a procurement of up to 14% of the total requirement. It introduced another new concept, which would establish a portfolio requirement. And by a portfolio requirement, we usually mean like a quota. A minimum percentage of the total amount that is delivered needs to come from these designated sources. And in this case, it would 4%, starting lower than that, starting at 0.4%, and then gradually building up over a period of years to reach 4% for a thermal portfolio standard. And then there's a lot of other details built in, including alternative compliance payment. That's what ACP stands for, alternative compliance payment for folks who fall short of meeting their requirement. They can just pay instead. They can pay money instead. And also other cost containment mechanisms. This graph that we put up here, I stole from a presentation that Dan made a couple weeks ago. And again, I don't know if you can see it from the back of the room, but it shows in purple Maine's, the new incremental amount of Class 1, I guess not incremental, but Class 1 renewables, and compares them to the other states. And so you see New Hampshire down in the gold going horizontally, and then you can see that in 2020, we're sort of there at the bottom of the pack. And then, according to the new legislation, this would bump us up by 2030 to being right at the top of the list. So that just gives you a sense relatively of where we've been and where we plan to be going in terms of the percentage of Class 1 new renewables.
Should note, I stole that chart from ISO New England, so I can't take credit for that.
There are certain areas in the world where it's appropriate and even approved to steal things, and being a lawyer is one of them. So you steal somebody else's words and then you put a footnote at the end, and it's considered even more valuable than if you'd made it up yourself. And stealing from ISO is a very authoritative source as well. So this is another one of those few cases. So let's jump in. I'm going to ask Dan to start maybe, and also Jeremy was very involved in this. I think everybody was. But what's the most significant change from what was before to what is after?
So I think, if this chart used to show Maine's RPS, or Class 1 RPS, kind of flatlining after 2017. That started in 2007 and grew 1% every year. And so what this does by having a gradual increase is really what we think is kickstarts or restarts a lot of the renewable development that can happen here in Maine, and should drive significant development across Maine and potentially New England, and really ensures that we know that we're going to be getting a certain percentage of our electricity from renewables. The procurement piece, I think, the PUC has done procurements before. Clearly, there's been development around and renewables here in Maine previously, but by showing the market that we are going to be offering long-term contracts for renewable energy development, we're allowing investments to be made here, and by showing that long-term financing, we're hopefully bringing that price down as well, and ensuring that it comes in at a competitive price. Renewable prices are dropping, and by showing this, we think that we're going to be able to get really strong pricing for these projects. I would note we're also allowing energy storage to participate in those procurements, so we see a big opportunity for storage here in Maine, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. I think it's a big part of this procurement. I'll let Jeremy talk a little bit more about some of the benefits. I'm just curious, how many people here testified before the legislature, not necessarily on this bill, but on any bill this session?
Look at that.
Yeah, so pretty.
It's wonderful.
Yeah, pretty great engagement throughout the process. It felt like maybe this whole room could have been there for the testimony on this bill, given how much time we spent talking about it, but felt to me like it was a really good process that ended up getting nation-leading legislation. I think this is the most ambitious RPS in the country, and now we're looking forward to implementing it, but I'll turn to Jeremy to talk about some of the other components.
Jeremy, I saw in your testimony that you talked about, well, a lot of things, both at a conceptual level, what you thought the benefits would be of this, what some of the policy and other benefits would be. Could you talk about that? I mean, I think a lot of people who might not be familiar with an RPS or with renewables, other than just maybe that they're cleaner, but it seems to me that part of the rationale for supporting this was that there are a lot of other benefits associated with it, and I wonder if you could speak to that, and also the cost side, because I know you guys did some analysis on what you thought the costs would be.
So thanks. Before maybe I launch in, I do just want to thank a couple people who are in here specifically. Senator Vitelli, who I think I saw her walk in. She was the lead sponsor on the bill and was just dogged in her determination to get this bill passed this session. Very easily could have fallen apart probably 24 times. And then probably a close second right behind Senator Vitelli would be Dan. There's absolutely no question that this bill would have either been carried over or just died if Dan wouldn't have challenged a number of us up on this panel and in the audience to come together. I mean, there were some pretty big gaps that needed to be bridged, and we spent a lot of time talking about a lot of the details. I mean, there were some days where I think Todd probably came in without a beard, and by the end of the day had a beard because we were working so long on this. But yeah, so I mean, the bottom line with an RPS is there's about 30 states that have them. And we know when they're designed well, they work. And so what does that mean that they work? They drive new investment, they create new jobs, they reduce pollution, and they do it typically through a competitive procurement process. So you're driving costs down as much as possible for your state's ratepayers. So what specifically do we get for this? And I think the legislature can and should, when somebody brings forward a big bill like this, challenge you and say, prove it to me. Your opinion is fine, but give me some sort of credible analysis that demonstrates that what you're saying is true. So we, with a number of other folks, commissioned a study or a study by Synapse and Sustainable Energy Advantage to basically do just that, to examine what are the benefits, when are they going to be realized, and then ultimately what are the approximate costs. So really what they found was it's going to reduce pollution from the electric sector by about 55%. It will create 170 jobs per year, every year between 2020 and 2030. And so what is the cost? And I'm sure we can spend a lot of time debating what the cost is, but about $1.50 per month for average residential ratepayer or a small commercial ratepayer. So, I think it's important to talk about the cost. I would argue we spent a lot of time the last 8 years in the previous administration talking about the cost and almost no time talking about the benefits. So it was really refreshing to be able to bring those ideas forward and have a conversation about not just what does this cost, but what do you get for it? What is the payback? And I think one of the things that demonstrated that we struck a good compromise was that nobody was really happy. There's things that we would all probably have added or taken away, but because we were forced to come together and present a unified package in front of the Energy Committee, I think we came to good solid ground. And, just to give you a demonstration of that, you don't typically see, the State Chamber of Commerce, the Natural Resources Council of Maine, the Associated General Contractors, and Maine Conservation Voters on the same floor sheet that gets handed out to the legislature. There's just not a lot of agreement on key issues. This was one of those issues that really galvanized those groups. So I think that's a sign of a good bill. And I think that's what I've got for benefits, Michael.
Can one of you talk a little bit about the procurement element of this? That seems like a new twist, and I'm not familiar with how it works or what the point of having it was. What's the advantage of having that? Jeremy, can you?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to it. I mean, if we want new renewables built in Maine, we need a procurement. People are not going to build projects without long-term contracts. It just so happens that now is a great time to lock in long-term contracting prices. Prices have never been lower. We've still got some federal tax credits that are available to us, so those will continue to help drive down prices. In terms of, I think Michael, you said before that we had done, or maybe Dan did, that we had done procurements. I think the thing that is different about this is it's a mandatory procurement. In the past, the Public Utilities Commission has had the authority to instruct the utilities to sign long-term contracts, but we hadn't done a whole lot of that in recent years. This is not optional.
So, two questions. One is, when will the first round of procurements be?
So it sounds like, in talking to the commission staff recently, that the first RFP is going to go out sometime in late winter, early spring. We had been hoping it would happen this year. It's not, but the law still requires them to approve finally executed contracts by December 31, 2020. So by the end of next year, we will have somewhere between 7 and 10% of Maine's total electric load under contract with renewable resources.
And do those percentages contribute towards meeting the full goal of the 80%, or are they on top of that?
Yeah, they're part of that. So we're sort of following in the steps of what a lot of other states, particularly in New England, have been doing for the last 4 or 5 years. So I would argue we're playing catch up, and both in terms of inviting the new investment in jobs, but playing catch up in terms of realizing ratepayer benefits sooner. So, Sometimes there's benefits to being the first. Sometimes it's good to learn from the mistakes of others and make sure that you don't sign bad contracts. But I think our timing is just right here. We have the benefit of learning from what Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and other states have been doing for the last number of years.
And another novel twist that I saw here was the institution of the 4% or rising up to 4% requirement for thermal RECs. It starts at just less than 0.5%. I'm wondering, I know, Todd, I saw some of the testimony that IECG filed on this. What was your perspective? And maybe you could take a second and say who IECG is too. Sorry, I should have done that.
Sure. So I'm Todd Grissett. I'm a lawyer with the firm Preddy Flaherty. Represent a variety of clients before the legislature and elsewhere. I worked with the Industrial Energy Consumer Group through this legislative session, as we have in many past years. Speaking today as myself, on behalf of myself, these are my opinions and my ideas, but I think they're aligned with what we were talking about consistently through the session. This bill is a dramatic change to the renewable portfolio standard, and as Michael was saying, the creation of a new thermal renewable portfolio standard is something that Maine has not done before, but we now are marching down that path. And effective 2021, suppliers of electricity will have to start procuring what they call thermal RECs, or T-RECs, which is pretty cute, in order to cover their load that they served electricity to their consumers. But what are those T-RECs? Those T-RECs represent the environmental attributes of heat that was delivered to an end-use consumer in Maine from a renewable resource. There's nothing to do with electricity in that. So if you burn wood, and it's renewable wood, and you give the heat to your neighbor, and that's end use that they're using in Maine, you could potentially get T-RECs for that, and you could get money that electricity consumers ultimately will have to be paying for you. This is the first time that we've had electricity consumers paying for heat that wasn't from an electric basis. It's a real departure, and I think we're trying to do things about climate in Maine. We're also trying to incorporate some social policy, and I think sometimes we're squeamish about explicitly stating that, but these are embodying explicit social preferences.
If I can jump in, I think it's important to note that, we're not the first to do this. Massachusetts has a program like this. New Hampshire does this. And I think if you look back at the chart that Michael put up about where our emissions come from, transportation's a big component of it, but heating is as well. And I think if you look at, 60% of our residences in Maine are heated with heating oil. You add propane to that, we're at over 70%. So we're incredibly dependent on fossil fuels to both fuel our vehicles, but also to heat our homes. And we need to begin taking steps to diversify that, and I think this incentivizing renewable thermal for heating and potentially cooling is a great way to do that.
And I'll chime in because I need to get to the next slide or we'll be here all day. That I saw from the testimony, and I know from some of the other bills that I was involved in, that there's a very serious concern in the Maine legislature about the health of the economy for our forest products industry, and there are folks that are going out into the woods to bring the product back in, and they need end uses for that will make that a viable undertaking economically. And so they have been looking for a little bit of help to make it more lucrative to bring that stuff out and have some end use for it. And so my sense is that for biomass boilers and other things that are working off of that, especially that lower grade wood, this is something that is designed to help that. And so I think if people are sitting there scratching their head saying, why on earth would they weave this into this electricity bill? I think that was probably a major driver. We could talk about this for another hour, but then we wouldn't get to the next slide. So I'm just going to pull the plug and do it. And with apologies to Jim and Beth, I'm going to try and weave you in here too next. So continuing on this topic of cleaner supply, bills that would drive cleaner supply, the second slide I have on this, and these are three other bills that we identified as being something we want to talk about. Another really big piece of legislation was 1711, which dealt with, and in part it dealt with net energy billing, and in part it dealt with this concept we've been talking about here called procurement, or entering long-term contracts. But here the focus is more on distributed generation, not central generation. So distributed generation is a term many of you probably know that we mean is it's spread around, it's sprinkled around. It's not at some big central place. It's out there on the grid at your home or at your business or at your school, and then it may get fed onto the grid. And this is obviously another place where there are economic and technical opportunities to be bringing in more cleaner supply, like photovoltaics and other small renewables. And so this bill, there have been some policies in place for quite a while in Maine, and this bill made some adjustments to those. One was it eliminated the cap limiting these shared projects, which you might see out on a farm somewhere in a rural part of Maine where there might be a big solar array, and it was limited to, net energy billing was limiting that to 10 subscribers, or a cap of 10 subscribers. And it was limiting that to projects that were no bigger than 0.66 megawatts or 660 kilowatts. So it changed that cap, it eliminated that cap, and it raised the maximum size allowable for one of those projects to 5 megawatts, which is quite sizable. And then it talks about extending the net energy billing program to commercial and institutional customers, in addition to where it currently resides with residential customers. So, and then it has this Part B of the legislation, which talked about directing the Public Utilities Commission to issue another set of competitive procurements and enter into these longer-term contracts. And it set goals for them, not goals, but required levels of procurement over a series of installments. So 125 megawatts for commercial and institutional customers over the next 5 years, and 250 megawatts for these shared distributed generation systems over the next 5 years. So, wow, that's a lot. It's a very long piece of legislation. There's a lot of detail in it. Maybe I'll start with Beth and just say, from the perspective of your organization and the groups that you represent, what did this represent? What was significant about this? And what are the benefits that we have to look forward to from it?
Hi, Beth Ahern, Maine Conservation Voters. So the big benefit of this bill is that there's going to be a lot of solar coming into Maine. And I just want to back up a little bit, because this bill, even though it passed grandly this year, it began in 2015. And in 2016, Speaker Gideon convened a stakeholder process that included the public advocate, utilities, environmental groups, and no one thought that there could be consensus. It was a year-long, bare-knuckle process, and Dylan Voorhees was there for the whole thing. And surprisingly, a consensus was reached in the middle of this session, and unfortunately, the governor vetoed it, and it failed override by 2 votes. So this policy has been sort of parked since 2016, and the bulk of this bill came from there. Certainly there have been some upgrades, but this has been a long time coming, and a lot of people. One of the things that Maine Conservation Voters brings to this is the people's voice. People want clean energy, and we actually polled this year to test that. We hired more information, the polling firm for Senator Collins, to see how Mainers felt about climate change and clean energy. And we asked Mainers, 500 people were polled, do you support a transition to 100% clean energy by 2050? 69% of Mainers said, yes, we do. So people want this, and I think the legislature followed suit.
Thanks.
I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, I saw from your testimony that there had been that survey result, and I was surprised at how strong those numbers were. But I've also watched folks at the legislature wrestle with this issue for a bunch of years. So
And I also, I need to thank Representative Barry, who's been at the forefront of this for a long time. His committee, he's chaired the committee. He's been a big solar proponent for a long time, through the bad times and the good. And also Dean Vikerson, who's not going to be with us after next year, but he's sat through the whole thing. They were both here in 2015 and 2016. And the committee, you know, the Energy, Utility, and Technology Committee is pretty new, 8 new members out of 13. Tina Riley was there last year, last session, but there were a lot of new members who had to deal with this really big bill that came to them at the end of the session. And kudos to them for wrestling with this bill and for understanding it and for making it better. So thank you very much, Representative Rikerson, Representative Berry, Representative Riley. You are amazing. So thank you.
Jim, I read in your testimony, I'm sorry, from Central Maine Power's testimony anyway, that they were in support of this bill ultimately. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you know, what the perspective was, what they were looking for to see in terms of principles or a principled approach to dealing with this, that, you know, what their perspective was on this. And also I'm kind of interested in whether it's you or the rest of the panel talking about where does this go from here? Is it done and up and running, or are there a bunch of steps that have to happen next?
Sure. Well, thank you, Michael. Jim Mitchell, Mitchell Tardy Jackson. So I do represent Central Maine Power, but I want to caution the audience that while I am their registered legislative agent, today I'm a bit of a free agent. So my opinions are my opinions. I would say on behalf of CMP, though, this bill and the RPS bill, I think, are responsive to two fundamentals Maine and the region are confronted with. One, while demand, load growth over the last decade has been relatively flat in the region and in Maine, if you look out over the next decade or two, if we are to succeed in electrifying transportation, load growth is going to happen here and across the rest of the country, and we need to get prepared for that. We are facing retirements of substantial amounts of generation across the region that needs to be replaced. And so the RPS bill and this bill don't just send signals to those who are interested in investing in generation, but they also have a concrete tool, which is competitive procurement. And the reality is, of course, as costs have declined, particularly on grid-scale solar, they're offering pricing which is quite cost competitive with the wholesale clearing price that is on average occurring in New England. I believe in Maine, the last procurement had solar at about 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour. That's a competitive rate. And so these bills, I think, are effective tools, particularly the long-term procurement. Now, in the past, the utility companies have typically been resistant to long-term contracting because of our experience under PURPA and mini-PURPA. I think we have to be realistic, though, that risk takers who are involved in developing generation need the assurance of some long-term contracting in order to draw enough capital to make a substantial difference in our generation and the supply that's going to be necessary out into the future. For CMP, I think there were some fundamentals about this bill that we expressed. One, we believe very much in the efforts that IECG has promoted for a long time, that generating your own electricity has to be protected. Two, we believe that whatever tariff is established for example, community solar, how that's developed, obviously the benefits to the grid have got to be recognized, and people who invest in those community solar projects or other types of distributed energy resources have to be rewarded appropriately for the benefit they're providing to the grid. And then ultimately, we also need to make the tariffs plain so that people can manage their bills effectively. And we're also, of course, in the long term concerned about cost. I will just make one last point, Michael, before you give me the hook and get me off stage. The most intriguing and potentially most important distributed energy resource in the future will be our vehicles. And the utility company has got to now start planning how to incorporate that future into their distribution planning. How will we take advantage of the massive amount of storage that is likely to be under the hoods of thousands and thousands of vehicles all across the state? CMP doesn't usually get applause, but thank you.
I wonder if one of you could speak a little bit to what's next. I don't have a clear sense of whether this thing is up and running now or whether this is something that's going to unfold over the next couple of years and what steps are going to happen to make that go. I don't know who's
Sure, I
best
can
situated
touch on that
to
quickly,
do
and
that.
folks feel free to jump in if I'm getting anything wrong. But there are currently 3 active rulemakings at the Public Utilities Commission, one around the procurement mechanism for the 2 solar programs that were mentioned, which will be declining block programs, and therefore will have a declining price mechanism in there, which I think is an important tenet of the legislation and the program. Those comments, there's a hearing on October 8th, and comments are due on the final comments are due on the 18th, so I would encourage people to participate in that. There was another proceeding on the net energy billing components, and comments are due on the 30th. And then a big component of this will be how is this technology interconnected and what is the process for that? And so there's going to be a proceeding happening around interconnection. My understanding of the schedule is the completion of these rulemakings by the end of the year, with a program launched by at least around sometime next summer. I think the legislation requires it to happen 10 months or so after it becomes law. So we'll see some contracts or some procurements and programs later next year.
Are those procurements on a schedule? Will they happen every year for X number of years, or is it sort of TBD?
There's going to be an initial procurement for to set the price, or the clearing price of the 2 declining block programs, and then that price will be set, and they will drop down automatically as those blocks get filled.
On an annual basis?
As soon as they get filled. Yeah, so it could be faster, and likely will be faster.
Let's take a minute to talk about the other 2 that are on this screen here. One eliminates gross metering, and I think that's pretty closely related to elements of the bill that we were just talking about. But can somebody fill us in about what this added to the picture?
I can take that.
Go ahead. Thanks, Todd.
So historically, we've had net energy billing, and it's been a practice that's helped a lot of customers integrate their own distributed generation resources into the grid, save money, and help the environment. Several years ago, the Public Utilities Commission changed its rules around net metering in a way that became really what we would call gross metering, required an addition of a second meter under certain circumstances, changed the way that the benefits are calculated in a way that really added costs and deprived consumers of the benefits. It was unpopular. I think everyone in this room would know that. And eventually, the legislature passed this law. It was really quickly done, really uncontroversial this year in my view. An act to eliminate gross metering, just put it back the way it was originally. And it did a couple other things, told the PUC that they cannot make any more rule changes till middle of 2020, and after that, it's going to be harder to make rule changes around net metering. Have to go to the legislature.
Just want to add that Representative Barry was the sponsor of that bill. He's been working on this issue for a long time, too, so thank you.
Amen.
Beth. And then maybe out of left field, but I thought it was interesting for the audience to just see the sort of the continuum of ways that policies can be made. We're talking about policies that direct the generators or the utilities who are regulated by the Public Utilities Commission, what they can and can't do and how much they have to do it. But there's also other tools in the toolbox. Tax policy is always one of those opportunities. I was not involved in this LD 1430, but it exempts PV, photovoltaics, and wind equipment from property and or real estate tax. I read some of the testimony that showed what other states do, and it looked to me like roughly half the states in the country have a similar provision that says no taxes, no property tax or real estate tax on this equipment. So if you add a PV system to your home, I think the part of the problem was that in some towns, assessors were putting a big value on that, and suddenly your property tax bill would jump up quite a lot, which wasn't very popular. And then in other towns, they would assess it almost zero value. So there was a real inconsistency between the towns, and I think they were looking for some guidance to have some uniformity. On the other hand, I'm not sure, I could see from some of their testimony that they were a little concerned about what this would do to revenues for their taxes. So I don't know that there's much more to say, but do any of the panelists have anything to chime in? It seems fairly straightforward how that's going to work, but yeah, Todd, go ahead.
Just to note, this is tax benefit and exemption that is extended to wind and solar now. We've already had the same tax benefits on the book for livestock, including farm animals, neat cattle and fowl, mines of gold, silver, or baser metals, snowmobiles, beehives, and animal waste storage facilities. Time for solar and wind, right?
That is a perfect way to wrap up the discussion on cleaner supply, talking about animal waste by comparison. So let's go to another category. It's, I abbreviated this GRID mod as short for grid modernization. And if you didn't already know, you probably can hear, weaved through all these responses and all these descriptions, that the grid plays a foundational role in making possible and impacting the economics of the types of clean supply that we think are going to be a critical element in reaching these long-term carbon reduction goals. And as we'll talk about in another couple minutes, they're pretty critical if you're buying equipment that runs off of electricity, because you need that system to work well and economically in order to make it economical for us to have these lights on and have HVAC and air conditioning in this building and so forth. So let's talk for just a minute about a couple of these bills that came up this year that will impact the grid and sort of put us on a bit of a turn, a little pivot here for what its priorities will include. One of these bills was 1173. This allows for the direct sale of electricity, and it looks to me like this bill was amended during the process. So it started out as one thing and it ended up as something which maybe had eliminated a lot of the more controversial elements of it. But I wonder, I know Todd, one of your clients had filed testimony in this. I wonder if you could just speak to it, and Jim, I'd also be interested in your perspective on what was significant about this, either what did make it through or what didn't make it through.
Sure. So from a big picture, when you generate electricity, most technologies are a thermal technology. Solar photovoltaics, not so hot, but the other ones make a lot of heat. If you can use the heat, you're going to get more out of what the fuel that you put into it. So if you can efficiently co-generate heat and electricity and find some way to use that heat, it's going to be a lot more efficient and everyone's costs will be lower. So would be useful in some circumstances if you had a thermal power plant that had electricity that it was making, if it could just sell some of that power to its neighbors. You got people right there, you may be able to avoid using the wires of the T&D utility, which will perhaps make them jealous of your treading into their franchise. But it could be efficient, it could save everybody money, and it could be the efficient environmental thing to do. We've had for years Public Utilities Commission precedent allowing this under certain circumstances. The Boralex Stratton case. In Stratton, there's a power plant that burns wood. It provided electricity to its neighbor, a sawmill. Years ago, CMP asked the Public Utilities Commission if that was really okay, given that Boralex wasn't a utility. And the commission said, upon looking at it, it's okay. They're not a utility. They're not a competitive electricity provider. They don't have to be under these circumstances. It's a sale across a fence to a neighbor. This law, I think, was designed to do much of those same things, put it into law. It does them in a little different way. It'll be interesting to see how they sit beside each other. But that tradition that we've had for the PUC's precedent, it persists even with this law.
So this is a little bit of an extension of the concept that you're allowed to make electricity and use it for yourself. And this is a case where you're making electricity and you're using some of it for yourself, but you have some surplus or maybe a lot of surplus, and you're selling it to somebody across the way who's adjacent to you.
Abutting, technically, under this new
abutting.
law,
So
which is technically different from adjacent, I learned.
Okay.
I was surprised.
Jim, do you want to add anything to what was going on here?
So without looking like, my grandfather's utility company, I think we got to at least have some concrete understanding that public utilities are a creature of the legislature. And as part of that, we got to understand the regulatory bargain that was allowed at that time, where the utility company was granted a monopoly franchise in return for ensuring that they would have the obligation to serve every customer within their territory. And there are potentially very expensive customers if you're way out at the end of a very rural area where there are no customers along the way for 3 miles of distribution line. So there's a tension always when there's incursions on the utility franchise by cherry-picking the best and most profitable customers. Ultimately, the utility companies felt that the Borelex test basically had it right, and this legislation sought to undermine what the PUC had done through their decision-making. Not in favor of the utility company, by the way, in that instance, but simply balancing those issues of the balance between the regulatory bargain and the opportunity for those who generate electricity to sell some of its surplus to at the time, a tenant or a nearby entity that abutted. So this is a little bit of an expansion of that. Ultimately, from my perspective, this is good for the utility companies in this way. It's direct competition for them for their best customers. They've got to get better at explaining the value proposition they're offering to customers, and this will drive them to do that. So it's not a disaster from their perspective. It's an incursion, and if there's too much of it, people who get left holding the bag are those in rural Maine. We simply have to face that. But this is not that bill. This is actually ultimately a way to drive the utility to be more competitive, more customer-focused, more focused on what matters to larger, best value customers.
But I guess it does illustrate that there are trade-offs. So there's the point Todd made, which is you have this ability to get a pretty good deal on some electricity or make your thermal plant more economically viable. At the same time, the utility may be losing a ratepayer or to some degree.
Right.
And so for the rest of us who are on that grid, we're going to have to pay more because the cost of the grid doesn't go down, right? The cost of the grid it is what it is. So whoever's left on the grid is the ones that got to pay for it. So these are some trade-offs we just have to be thinking about.
I mean, we have substantial amount of physical plant, and that physical plant has to be upgraded and made to continue to be reliable for us to meet our central mission that the legislature charged the public utility with, which is to provide safe, adequate electric service at just and reasonable rates. And we need to have a certain amount of rate paid to the utility by customers in order to do that. The reality, of course, what's the fundamental obstacle for more imaginative thinking in the utility space? We are prisoners of the volumetric imperative. We are still based upon, even though we're just a delivery company, our payments are based upon how much people use. There's some decoupling going on, of course. The last rate case demonstrated that, where flat fees for all customers have increased versus what you pay by volume for your your distribution, your transmission distribution. As that decoupling continues, I think you'll find the utility enterprise generally will become more inventive and imaginative how to collaborate and cooperate with distributed energy resources as well as solar and other entities that hopefully will advance the decarbonization of our commerce.
So let's jump to the next one, which was 1181. And I'm wondering if Barry Hobbins or anyone from the Public Advocate's office is in the audience. I didn't see them in my quick scan around. But 1181 was a bill to establish a new coordinator for non-wires alternatives and a process for promoting non-wires alternatives. And I'll do I think of looking across the panel here, I might be in a better position to summarize what this was about. But when Central Maine Power or Emera or any other utility wants to upgrade the grid or build, for example, out by the main mall, if the growth has gotten so big that it's time to build some more capacity to feed that part of the grid, they have to come to the PUC and request permission for that and to get approval for the cost of that. And what non-wires alternatives is looking at alternatives to that grid system upgrade. So instead of adding more wires and more poles and more substations, the question is, could you achieve the same reliability of serving that new growing load out by the main mall more cost effectively through some alternative? Rather than more poles and wires, could we do it with installing a generator there, like a big PV system? Or could we do a whole bunch of energy efficiency and switch everyone to LED lights or more efficient air conditioning and solve the need for that little piece of the grid some other way that would be less costly for Maine's ratepayers? And so what this bill does is it says, number one, there will be a new process. Every time that has to happen, there's going to be an independent non-wires alternative coordinator, and that coordinator will live at the Office of Public Advocate, and they will do the math. They will do the cost-benefit comparison of what the utility is proposing, and they'll look around and figure out what the alternatives are through energy efficiency and demand response and other things that would potentially be cheaper. And if their analysis shows that it would be less costly to invest in these alternatives, then they will start the process of figuring out how to purchase and install those alternatives. And so this bill lays out how that process will work. I think it was a pretty elegant solution. I think there was contributions from the Governor's Energy Office and from IECG and from Central Maine Power, all very helpful in that. But the Public Advocate's Office, our office, were quite involved in it, and a lot of the environmental advocates were also quite involved in it. This is something that we're seeing crop up in other states, like New York has been quite active in promoting something like this. And so I think it's pretty interesting to see that Maine has now added this to its repertoire. It's going to be a more deliberate process in choosing how big we build our grid and how much money we spend on that, and whether we might find alternatives that are cleaner, that might be good for the environment and good for the economy. So I don't know, Beth, I might start with you. I don't know whether your organization or some of the folks that you work with had input on this or had views on this. Do you have a comment on sort of whether this was a priority or whether this was something that you were supportive of?
Maine Conservation Voters was not involved in this. I'm sure NRCM was. So I do want to say this is my opportunity to make a little pitch. So you might have seen in the hallway, we produce a scorecard every year. This just came out. There's a lot in here about clean energy and climate change. And like Michael said, it doesn't cover everything, but it touches on lots of energy legislation. And two of the bills that Representative Riley sponsored are covered in here too. And it goes back, Jim talked about electric vehicles and what are we going to do about that? Well, Representative Riley had a bill to direct the PUC to conduct a transportation electrification pilot project. So thank you for doing that. And she also sponsored a bill to create an energy storage commission that will look on how we're going to actually, the possibilities of that. So thank you for that.
Both of which are on our next slides. So you are going off script and you're going to get demerits for that. There were strict instructions that you are not following. Dan, anything to add about this? I mean, it's a pretty esoteric concept, but I know, speaking for our organization that works with Maine's customers to help them manage their energy costs with whatever tools they have in the toolbox, whether it's anything, as we say in the business, on the customer side of the meter. We're pretty excited about this because we think it's going to give it a new way to get some revenue to help support those kinds of projects in a way that will be a net benefit for them and for the grid and the ratepayers on the grid.
Yeah, I think you have it exactly right. And when I talk about, the folks about this legislative session, most of the attention is placed on the RPS, the solar bill, and the climate council, kind of these big issues that get a lot of attention. But then you start talking about non-wires alternatives. We're going to talk about beneficial electrification, and then you really start to also, see some of the energy nerds or experts' eyes light up because they know that there's such potential in non-wires alternatives, or at least the consideration of them and putting some policy framework around them. And so I think it's an exciting place for Maine to be.
Michael, if I could just jump
Yes,
in
Jim.
very briefly. I know I've already spoken too much. I would say this. Non-wires alternatives, this legislation in some respects is the flip side of the Distributed Energy Resources Bill because it's a way to achieve that objective more quickly by forcing the utility companies to be a lot more thoughtful about their proposed transmission and distribution projects. What's the concern of the utility companies fundamentally on this? Well, they have the regulatory obligation to provide reliable service. If another entity is going to do it in lieu of the utility company and they fail and customers are stranded without adequate service, who's going to be responsible? So that's an issue that has to be dealt with, and hopefully it can be done in an appropriate manner. We support ultimately the legislation, and we had some concerns about it initially, but we believe it's an appropriate policy tool to advance the grid and reliability for things like voltage control and other things that can be done more economically and efficiently through the build-out of distributed energy resources versus wires solutions only.
Thanks.
And I would just add, anytime I think, in the dry world of energy that you can include in statute the same acronym as a 1980s rap group, it's a win.
You had to go there. I was really hoping that wasn't going to come up, which is why I've turned the page. So we've talked about supply, we've talked about the grid, which delivers the supply. Now let's talk about the end use, or the demand. There were several bills. These two rose to the top of our list for discussion this morning. The first one, LD 1766, was a governor's bill to establish a goal of installing 100,000 high-performance heat pumps in Maine by the end of the next 5 years. To help pay for that, the statute directs Efficiency Maine Trust to take a particular revenue stream that it now receives and deploy that exclusively for advancing this goal. So we used to use it for some other things. Now we're going to use it for this. We have some of our funding comes from our electric conservation charge budgets, and so these funds will be added to that. We also use some RGGI dollars to promote heat pumps. And the statute also specifies that we have to supplement but not supplant, are the magic words they use, which usually means you can't just take this new money and use it to displace the old money you were using. This has to be incremental. It has to be additive. So we're in the process at Efficiency Maine Trust of trying to figure out how we're going to do that. We are looking forward to instituting that ASAP. And I should also mention another thing that came out of this was not in statute necessarily, but importantly during the discussions, the Maine Housing Authority was involved and noted that they could legally use some of their funds to help make sure that this goal for reaching 100,000 heat pumps and the benefits, the economic and environmental benefits that would flow from that, could be extended to lower income Mainers as well as market-based programs. So there's some funding there to help ensure that there's an equity element to this, and Efficiency Maine's programs also tend to have a variety of programs, some of which are designed for low-income homes and some of which for the market-based programs, and also for small businesses and other commercial customers. So we're envisioning this would be more than a doubling of the rate of heat pump uptake that there's been. I think when you think back to that very first slide that we showed and where all of the greenhouse gas emissions are currently coming from in Maine, after transportation, the next biggest slice of that was from residential. And most of that, I believe, is for home heating, not surprisingly. So a lot of the studies that we read and what I think we'll end up talking about in the Maine Climate Council process will be about how we could reduce our greenhouse gases from our homes, and it may be that these heat pumps play a significant role in that. That's part of what I would expect. Beth, I think the environmental advocates were pretty active and supportive in this. What benefits do you see coming from heat pumps? Maybe I just stole the thunder, but anything you can add to that?
I don't know what's more to add. I will say, though, that one of our concerns is heat pumps are effective if you have insulated buildings, right? So these, the implementation part, what's next? We want to make sure that we do weatherization as well as putting heat pumps, particularly into, trailers or places that aren't built to be well insulated.
Dan, the governor's office, this was a governor's bill. What do you think are some of the keys to success for this bill going forward?
Yeah, we're excited about it, I think, for the reasons that you mentioned, Michael, around electrifying or at least providing alternatives for the heating sector, making up, such a big component of our emissions and what Mainers are relying on to heat their homes. I grew up on a small dairy farm in central Maine, and we have an oil boiler, a wood boiler, a wood stove, and a heat pump. I know not everyone has something like that, but your idea about heat pumps, not ripping out old boilers, but really being an additional heating component, I think is something that is going to be exciting, reducing costs, and actually, some analysis shows that this is going to suppress electricity prices when implemented. I know utility put that comment in. I'll just say that the governor signed this bill at Kennebec Valley Community College, and I think this also, brings the workforce component to this conversation of training Maine's workers and providing good paying jobs. We had a national energy efficiency report come out that said that there were 8,600 jobs, energy efficiency jobs in Maine, and we're excited about the opportunity that this can help add to that, and excited to get the program launched.
Thanks. Anybody else want to chime in on this?
Heat pumps are a tremendous opportunity. The technology's come quite a big ways. Consumers who adopt them can save money, can reduce their own environmental outputs, and the grid can, as you point out, through beneficial electrification, which we're about to talk about, there are ways in which everyone's electricity rates can go down as more of us use more power for these things.
Yeah, I'm recalling Emera Maine, which is the utility that serves sort of Bangor and parts north, testified that in their territory, they estimated that every 1,000, I'm going to get the math wrong, but it was going to have a suppressing effect on the rates in their territory. They've got this. It's like they build these highways, a 3-lane highway, and people are only using 1 lane of it right now. And so by spreading, going back to Jim's point about how the utilities are compensated through a volumetric charge. So if we have some more people using those highways and paying their tolls, it will we'll be able to lower the toll in a sense. We'll be able to lower the rate that everyone has to pay on a per unit basis.
Just to clarify a little bit for Emera, they because they built out their system to serve a lot of Maine mills that have since closed or largely slowed production, they have unused capacity on their system. So their prior CEO was a strong advocate way long ago on expanding heat pumps. But think about this. The governor's effort here is to expand this to 100,000 heat pumps across the state. I think we only have about 660,000 dwellings in the state. So that's a massive change in heating load, very substantial, very important, but it goes back to a point I made earlier. Demand curve is going to start to escalate very substantially in Maine and the region, and we need a plan for that in terms of the generation. Not necessarily the wires and the transmission distribution plant, though that's going to be effective to some extent, but generation is going to be critical to attract to the region.
Can I just add, I think this is also a good example of work that has happened here in Maine before, even before this legislative session. I think there are, Michael, 40,000 heat pumps in Maine already, yeah, which is, I think, really significant. You don't see that penetration in states across the country. So a lot of really good work has already happened on heat pumps, and I think this is gonna boost that work so there's even more of it.
Thanks. The other bill we identified here was LD 1464, the Beneficial Electrification Bill for short. Has a much longer name than that. And it did a couple things. It introduced a definition for what that would mean, and I put that up on the board. I won't review it. And then it called for, number one, a study by our organization to be reported back to the legislature in February, identifying the barriers to more beneficial electrification and identifying potential opportunities to do more of it. And then also it directed the Public Utilities Commission to issue a request for proposals for pilot projects on using beneficial electrification for transportation. So this is going to what Jim was talking about before, where we may be seeing, we hopefully will be seeing more and more electric vehicles on the roads, and when they go home to charge up, jumping off from a point Jim was just making, if everybody goes home at the end of the workday and does what we all do with our cell phones at the end of the workday, which is to go right home and plug them right in, if we all do that at the same time, it's going to create a significant draw down on the grid. And both the power plants that provide that and the grid infrastructure, the wires that serve that, may be overtaxed if once there's enough electric vehicles in the marketplace, and if they all do that at the same time. So it would be really cool if we could find ways to have that charging delayed to a time of day that is not peak demand, but maybe the middle of the night when no one else is using the grid very much. So there are lots of actually pretty cool tools in the toolbox to do that, and I think part of what this is looking at is piloting some of those different tools in the toolbox to see what would be the lowest cost and the most effective. Anybody want to chime in on that?
Well, I would say, in addition to that, what if we were smart enough to look at where electric vehicles were concentrated, and instead of building more distribution plant to ensure that there isn't a problem with the distribution system, we had more distributed energy resources that were located near there to manage the voltage that would occur from that charging. So there are a lot of ways that the utility companies have got to be more, not just cooperative with the developers of distributed energy generation, but also collaborating with them to locate the facilities in the places that are most going to need a sturdier, more reliable, more robust grid because of the concentration of electrified vehicles as well as other resources.
Thanks. I have the opportunity right now to get on schedule if I go to the next slide. Do people have something they want to add? It's got to be like super good.
Look at that list of the carbon emissions on your slide 4. Transportation is number 1.
Yeah.
If we want to address climate change, we need to focus there.
I think we'd be remiss to say we're not talking about electric vehicles, the legislation, but there is now a new rebate program, Michael, that you're offering, which I think is important to highlight.
That's right. Put a plug in, no pun intended, for the recently launched EV rebates, not only for all electric vehicles, battery electric vehicles, but also plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, which are quite affordable. And if you do the math on the economics, you'll see that it's a really good deal for your operating costs. It will help you save money on operating those. And so there's nice rebates that are available thanks to the work of the governor, actually, from when she was the Attorney General, and won a nice lawsuit against Volkswagen for violating state consumer protection laws and environmental laws. And the settlement of those violations has been delivered to Efficiency Maine Trust to administer for this rebate program. So we're really excited to have an initial down payment on something to help start addressing that part of the graph that you were talking about, Todd, and that 54% of the state's greenhouse gas emissions.
$5.1 million, right?
Yeah, $5.1 million, not too shabby. So we'll try to put it to good use, but we actually need everyone in this room to go out and do their part and get out there. In fact, I would encourage folks to look at it sooner than later, because the federal tax credits that are also out there are on a declining scale. And so as time goes on and more people buy these, the federal tax credits shrink. So for certain brands of cars right now, the federal tax credits are at the highest they're going to be. And so it would behoove you to pull the trigger sooner than later. Okay, so the last slide that we had before we get to questions from the audience was about some studies. And they may seem innocuous, but there's a lot potentially packed in there. I don't intend to really dive too deep into them. I think it's especially important for the audience to know that these are happening and that there's ways for them to have input to these if they want. Dan, the first one on the list was the transmission solutions. That falls under your office. Do you want to take a second to talk about what the process is looking like going forward?
Sure. So we are going to be conducting a stakeholder working group that will start later this month to bring together folks to look at transmission issues as it relates to renewable energy development and trying to address or think about opportunities to look at those constraints. Going to have ISO New England come in and really give a group a 101 on what those issues are. I don't, Jeremy, you were involved in this. I don't know if you have anything to add to.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think the other thing I'd add is just if we're going to add any sort of substantial amount of grid scale renewables, we're going to have to start talking about infrastructure. We've been talking for my 11 years about quote unquote unlocking Northern Maine's renewable energy potential. If we're going to do that, we need to actually plan for it. It's great that we've got developers who are interested in that area. It's probably an area of the state that has the most supported population, except for maybe Washington County may be ahead of them. But we need to actually understand where are weak spots in the system, where might we beef them up, what is the cost, and then if we do that, what do we get for that investment?
So I don't know if everyone in the audience is able to decode that, but you can't just shoot electricity off a satellite and then have it come down where you want it to go. Not yet, anyway. Dan's office is going to maybe invent that as a result of this study. But I think what Jeremy's saying is the best, the most economic, and the strongest wind resources are in the northern part of the state. And there is not enough transmission line capacity to get it from there down to where most of us live and work, which is down here and along the coast. And so it would be nice to build it, but we wouldn't be able to send it anywhere. It would be stuck there. So that's only half the equation to get it built. You also have to have the means to transport it to where you're going to use it. And we have a shortage there right now. And so I think that's a key thing that people who aren't in the business wouldn't necessarily, you wouldn't have any reason to know that. Seems like there's transmission lines everywhere. They must be able to get it from point A to point B. But I think people just don't need to be reminded that there's not enough of it right now to get that additional power out. So the next study on the list was the benefits of energy storage. I don't know who among you has been involved in that. I frequently hear Dan championing this topic. Do you want to take a second and say what is driving this and what the process will look like?
Sure. So it's a legislative commission to study energy storage. I believe Representative Riley and Senator Vitelli will be helping lead that task force or that commission. Really, so if you think about electricity, it is the only major commodity which doesn't have a supply chain, right? Like your food gets picked, it gets stored, it gets put somewhere. That doesn't exist for electricity. You turn the light on and you expect it to be there. And so energy storage can really be a game changer with how we think about our electric grid. Energy storage can also be many things. It can be voltage regulation, it can be a peak shaver, it can be a number of different things. And trying to figure out how to value energy storage is, I think, really important. I think there are a number of states that are trying to do that. A number of them are in New England. There's a real opportunity for Maine to take a leadership role in that. And I think this commission will try to suss out some of those issues and make recommendations. I think, again, it's going to be a lot in the RPS procurement. It potentially might have incentives in the solar procurement or those programs, but this is really a kind of a really good next step for Maine's energy future to be thinking about these issues.
And the last one on the list was 1844, which is studying ownership of Maine's power delivery systems. I think this was a resolve, if I'm not mistaken, to address a bill, a very substantial bill that came in and had a lot of discussion, but didn't, it ended up getting carried over, if I'm not mistaken. And that was Representative Berry's bill to restructure the electric utilities. And I guess I wonder if one of you could speak to what is known about the process. When does that study, has it launched? I understand that it's going to be managed by the Public Utilities Commission. I'm not really sure where that is process-wise, but if somebody could speak to that. And then I'd also love to hear from the panelists about what you think some of the key questions or issues that you think will be important for that study to address.
I'll just say from a process perspective, the PUC is conducting the study and is in the process of hiring a consultant. I believe that it's been nailed down, and a report on this is due mid-March, but I'll let others fill in the gaps.
What do folks think would be like, what would you like to see the study address in terms of key questions? I don't know who.
So the statute, the resolve does give guidance on what the study has to include. It has to include costs and benefits, both short-term and long-term, examination of legal, regulatory, financial, technical barriers. What are the impacts going to be, positive and negative, on the state, impacts on electricity rates, utility employees, ratepayers, and then what are the other alternatives? So that's the minimum study scope. If that sounds ambitious, I think that's right. But we're talking about a major concept here. Whether you like it or not, it's impossible to describe as other than groundbreaking. This would be a very significant change to the way we do things, and this study will hopefully yield answers on what it would look like.
So more information, more information for the legislators to consider when they tackle this big issue. Jim, do you want to chime in?
Sure, I'd be remiss if I didn't at least talk about government-owned power versus the current model we have. But realistically, the utility companies, particularly CMP, have got to regularly justify whether or not the citizens should continue to have the current system to deliver their electricity. Public power is prevalent in other parts of the country. We shouldn't deny that. It exists. But I think roughly 73% or so of all Americans receive their energy from an investor-owned utility, the model that mostly covers Maine. There are consumer-owned utilities and co-ops here in Maine, but I think that rather than wring our hands, those of us who work for or represent utilities, we've got to face the fact that we have got to do a good enough job to justify that the franchise that we've been granted continues to be a beneficial way for Mainers to get their electricity, and that'll be part of the debate in the coming session.
Are there key questions or issues you hope that the study looks at?
So I think one of the most important aspects of this will be to parse out what are the costs that the utility companies today, the transmission and distribution folks, can actually control. Because there's a lot of focus on increased transmission in Maine. And that's a concern, particularly for Todd's clients in IECG. And transmission is a concern for all of us because it's gone up substantially over the last decade. But people need to understand much of that is driven by the investments made in the New England region, where costs, even though the project was built in Connecticut, costs are socialized to every user of the transmission system in the region, in the ISO New England control area. So that's been the driver for transmission cost increases for Maine entities. It hasn't been choices that Central Maine Power has always made, but instead there are reliability standards imposed on the RTOs, the regional transmission organizations, by the North American Electric Reliability Council, who actually acts as an agent for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to make sure the system is reliable enough. That's where transmission cost increases. So whether you have an investor-owned utility or a publicly owned utility, that won't change. The distribution plan, on the other hand, and the investment there, the question for Mainers will be, is a public entity the best mechanism to ensure reliable supply? And the debate ought to be had. Representative Barry has promoted it aggressively, and we'll have to defend what we believe is the better model.
Thanks. So we've talked about the framework, which is the, among other parts of the framework, the sort of long-range thinking about goals for greenhouse gas reductions. We've talked about some new policies impacting how our energy supply may get cleaner to advance those goals. We've talked about some elements of modernizing the grid so that it can play its role in bringing that cleaner supply to market. And then we talked about a couple of bills that will potentially impact the end uses of energy and promoting cleaner and more efficient end uses, and then a couple of these studies. So I feel like we made some progress on getting the basic picture out there of what the considerations were, what some of the benefits and costs are. But I'd love to hear from the audience now what some of your questions might be for the panel. And I can jump in if it's something that's in my wheelhouse. So there are two mics, one over here and one, so one in each aisle. And we would welcome folks to stand up and would be especially grateful if you could keep your questions fairly short so that we can allow time for answers and also for other people to ask questions. Representative Rikerson, welcome.
Well, thank you.
Maybe give 1 second to the technician to switch to the mic. There you go. Give it a try.
1, 2.
Try it again.
Okay, yeah.
There you go.
Dean Rikerson from District Number 1. We've talked a lot about the grid, and in some ways, it's kind of the easier problem. And so I wanted to ask about wheels and where we are on TCI, and I guess that's Dan's, our membership in TCI and how it's working out.
Great. So the TCI stands for the Transportation and Climate Initiative. Thanks for the question, Representative Rikerson. This is a collaboration that was announced late last year between, I believe, 13 states, going from all the way down to North Carolina or Virginia north. We are monitoring those conversations. The idea here is some sort of regional solution to transportation emissions and tackling that. And what is being discussed there, at least initially, is some sort of cap and invest type program, almost like RGGI. Details are still being put together. Have been listening sessions happening throughout the region, and so we're monitoring those conversations. I should note that there is a symposium being held in Vermont to focus on rural issues. A lot of attention in this regional conversation is being focused on kind of environmental justice, more urban communities, and we have partnered with the other Northeast New England states to make sure that there's a real focus on how will this impact states and with more rural populations. And so we're working through that. I don't have an update on timing. I think the initial proposal was to have something for the governors to consider by the end of the year. It could be sometime next year, but we're monitoring those conversations closely as it's an important issue for Maine.
Thank you. And I neglected to ask if you could introduce your name and your association if you have one, or affiliation. Thanks. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, my name is Ted Gifford for RLC Engineering, and we are a sustaining member of E2 Tech. My question revolves around the fact that we do an awful lot of the interconnection applications to the utilities, and presently have generated over 50% of those that are in the queue. So we understand the total quantity of the applications that are being applied for. And the question basically is, they're outstripping the LD 1711 total megawatts already. So when is Rev 2 coming out?
I could answer a slightly different question. I don't know when Rev 2 is coming out, but I will tell you that Massachusetts has had an experience similar to this, where they will set a goal, people will say, wow, that's a handsome incentive, I would like in on that. They fill the interconnection queue, they overfill the interconnection queue, and then regulators have to play catch up, and what they've done several times is increase the mandate of how much is being procured every time. They've done it for the SMART program, they've done it for the SREC program, they're doing it with offshore wind. So that may be a future that Maine could choose.
I think it's really important to make sure that there are not boom-bust cycles for the solar industry and ensuring that there is some sort of long-term planning. So I think, again, what you've seen in Massachusetts is a rush and then a stop and then a delay. I mean, they've been incredibly successful with the amount that they've installed, but I think ensuring that there's a sustainable policy framework for solar is incredibly important.
And I think as well, the utility companies have got to put a microscope on their own efforts to be cooperative and collaborative with those seeking interconnection agreements. Are we streamlining that process sufficiently? Are there better ways to do it? We have an obligation to make sure the system is reliable and robust and can handle the interconnection. But nonetheless, are there ways for that to be streamlined, and can we collaborate more effectively with those who seek to build these facilities? That's critical, and I think the company's committed to do that.
I also think it's important that, we heard earlier that there's a number of PUC rulemakings, one of them being interconnection. It's ensuring that the PUC rules that are put in are enforced in a way that we don't effectively just have squatters, right? We don't want people sitting in the queue in perpetuity. There needs to be some demonstration of how serious you are about the project, site control, et cetera. Those types of things, maybe some sort of non-refundable application fee, things that prove that that your project is real, and this is not something that you're just going to sit on and not move forward with.
Great answers. Thank you. Yes, sir.
My name is Bill Franks, and my company is Independent Power and Renewable Energy. On your first slide, you showed that transportation was perhaps the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in Maine. But I've heard no discussion of incentives for either individual automobile owners or trucks or transportation for transition to electrification, for electric autos and electric trucks and things like that. And so I was wondering if one of the panel members could perhaps summarize what the current state of play in Maine is, and is there anything in the pipeline or under consideration for movement in this direction going forward?
I'll take a crack at that. So if you go to efficiencymaine.com/EV, you will find a pretty extensive web page describing rebates that are available for individuals and businesses to purchase a qualifying electric vehicle, including a battery electric vehicle or a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. $2,000 for a battery electric vehicle, $1,000 for a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, getting a minimum 20 miles per electric battery charge. That's $7,500 for any level of state, local, county government, or any government entity, and also a 50% increase on the regular incentives for anyone who's qualified as low income. So we have something called the EV Accelerator Program, and I just described to you the rebates that are available for that. Also, a year ago, the Maine DOT and the Maine DEP issued requests to fleets in the state that wanted to upgrade their fleets using also a different segment of Volkswagen settlement funds, and there was some electrification through that as well. So, and then a third part of that was that $3.1 million out of that was given to the Efficiency Maine Trust to install high-speed DC fast chargers for electric vehicles and to establish a network of chargers across the state. And so we've awarded about half of those, 2/3 of those funds already. So you should see EV, in addition to the Tesla chargers that are already out there in the world, there will now be universal chargers at the Kennebunk plazas north and south, at West Gardner on the Turnpike, and then in North Windham, Farmington, and Skowhegan. Those have already been put under contract, and then we will be looking to extend those fast chargers up the coast along Route 1 and across 295 over through Bangor down to Ellsworth. So you'll have some infrastructure, and hopefully we'll have some people buying some cars, and we'll be on our way.
Thank you.
Good morning.
I'm Heather Deese. I'm an independent consultant with Beach Hill Consulting. I'm tempted to ask you, Michael, what you would do with another $100 million, but I won't. I'm curious about 1766 and the heat pumps. Thinking about what a large percentage of those homes that are heating oil heated are run off a central heating system or run a central heating system, and how difficult it is, practically speaking, to replace that heat with air source heat pumps when we don't quite have the air source heat pump technology that replaces that central boiler the way that many of us would like. And so ground source geothermal heat pumps, I'm curious about whether they qualify under the 1766 legislation, or what you all are thinking about in terms of how to jumpstart the geothermal residential heating in Maine. I know there's a company that I'm watching that's spun out of Google X called Dandelion Geothermal that's working in upstate New York. I see Dan nodding his head, and I have this like dream of how do we get Dandelion here to Maine. So I'm just curious about what you all are thinking about, whether it's realistic and whether we can get it to be affordable to do geothermal residential.
Are there any geothermal vendors or installers in the room? Raise your hand. I don't see any. Heather, great question. There is currently an incentive at Efficiency Maine Trust for, I believe, $3,000 towards a residential geothermal system. So there's not nothing, there's something. They're quite expensive in the first instance, and so we tend to see them more with new construction than with retrofit. And they may be a better fit economically with commercial applications, or what we would call commercial institutional applications, than residential, because there's quite a bit of capital expenditure up front. And so for homeowners, that sometimes is just a lot to swallow. Whereas for institutional, like schools and campuses and things like that, or bigger buildings, it may work a little better. We're not planning to use any of those to count towards the 100,000 heat pump goal, but hopefully they're not mutually exclusive. Hopefully they're complementary.
They are included in the T-RECs that Todd was talking about. They're as an eligible technology, so as that program gets designed and rolled out, they'll get consideration there too for additional incentives.
Why don't we come to this side of the room, and then we'll bounce back and forth. Yes, please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Tom Twist. I'm from Bates College. And my question is actually prompted by something that Beth said, which is about building codes.
You probably knew this was coming, which is why she split.
No, it's a softball question. I noticed the second biggest chunk of our emissions is residential. And so what are folks' thoughts about building codes going into the future in terms of energy efficiency, updating to a more aggressive building code standard? And also, what is how to deal with the problem of retrofits, which we have a lot of old homes in Maine. It's kind of a thorny problem. It's not a one-size-fits-all and sort of an invasive type procedure. So anyway, just thoughts.
Well, I'll start with one thought, which is I expect this to be a prominently featured topic of conversation in one of the working groups that is going to be part of this Maine Climate Council. I am the co-chair of the Buildings, Infrastructure, and Housing Working Group. I'm going to have to find an acronym very soon that's easier to say than that, but I have no doubt that building codes is going to be one of the more prominently featured topics. It's considered pretty invasive. And there have been building energy codes on the books. They are a widely recognized tool in the toolbox for achieving energy savings and greenhouse gas savings from that sector. And so they're definitely on the list, but for reasons that you sort of, I think, are implied in your question, they're challenging. They're challenging because you've got it. The building codes in Maine are enforced by 495 towns. So you got to get 495 folks or forms of government, entities of government to come along with you, and then you've got to enforce it. And there's usually not enough. It usually applies to new construction. Well, there's not a ton of new construction in some of these smaller towns. So there's not a full-time person whose job it is to run around and do that. So the enforcement of it is challenging and somewhat costly, and it certainly bumps into Mainers' sensibilities about the decision-making they get to make in their own property. And then the retrofit question is a whole other kettle of fish, which does not have an easy answer, but I think that's why you see these programs, these programs like the Efficiency Maine programs, which help incentivize people for that moment when they are doing something, when they are buying a new piece of equipment or they're refinancing their home, some momentous occasion, you try to grab them at that time and maybe help them along financially. So I think that's the most likely. But other ideas, welcome. Get them into that working group.
Hey, good morning. I'm Chris from Sunrun and on the board of E2 Tech. Thanks for the great panel this morning. I just want to make sure we don't miss the economic development that's already happening because of the legislation that was passed last year. You know, I work out of state mostly, but today I see colleagues from national energy companies, from perhaps the largest international energy company in the world, and they're already hiring people in Maine and doing business here. So I just want to say I think Maine is open for business now as a result of this legislation. Then I have a question. The other states around us in New England have retail-facing programs to reduce system peak costs on the transmission and the capacity market side. We call those bring your own device programs. Wondering if you think here in Maine we can create those programs under the legislation that passed last session, or if we need new legislation this session.
Anyone on the panel want to tackle that?
I think the PUC could create programs that start working towards what you're talking about. Massachusetts, for example, has a clean peak energy standard, so on peak, the resources providing the power on peak have to be clean. That's an overlay on top of all their other requirements. Something Maine could explore. I think the PUC could potentially go down that road if it wanted to. The legislature certainly could direct them to do so if they chose. So far, they haven't done that. There is some guidance in there in some of the Mars alternatives and some of the other bills to think about those kinds of issues, but I don't think that door's fully opened at the legislature yet.
The BYOD programs will be a part of the Storage Commission, or it's written in there that will be considered too. So you can see opportunities there, and I think it's exciting what the other states are doing on that.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yes?
Hey, how you doing? My name is Eric Stevens from SunPower Corporation. Mike, earlier you stated, the definition of DG is to be distributed generation, and Jim, I think you may appreciate this question. Is there any current...
Have we established that I don't actually know what I'm talking about? So you direct your question down there. If that wasn't clear before, I just want to make it clear right now.
The 5 megawatt cap, currently right now in an environment where there is no single parcel rule, you quickly can achieve a very large plant in a location that could have quickly adverse impacts to a substation. Is the policymakers considering any type of implementing a single parcel rule to try to specifically distribute what is coming online?
And
the short answer is yes. I mean, I know in some of the rulemaking comments that came in, including some that we submitted, was exactly that. The projects that are in excess of 5 megawatts should be bid into the RPS procurement, and there shouldn't be, a project stacking where you sort of fool the commission into doing 10 5-megawatt parcels when in reality it's a 50-megawatt solar project.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
I'd also point out that distributed generation procurement, it embodies another one of these social preferences I was mentioning. It was sort of the farmer's market equivalent. Rather than buying factory-farmed, large-scale procurements, we're going to buy a bunch of small-scale procurements from a bunch of small-scale projects. That could be a valid way to do it. It's not likely to lead to the lowest costs.
Yeah, I think the distinction, at least from my perspective, that the legislature was making was, yes, you're going to realize more economies of scale with the grid-scale projects. However, they also require transmission infrastructure investments. So clearly, that's the pitch with DG, is that you're talking about tying in at the distribution level and not requiring as much substation improvements or brand new 345 kV builds. So yeah, I mean, ideally, you're doing both. There's certainly room for both, and I think justification for both.
Thanks. Yes, sir.
Hi, good morning. My name is Joshua Barber. I work for Iberdrola and Avangrid, and my question is actually more personally driven. I'm sort of a free agent, as some of the panelists mentioned, and it follows really naturally to the question that was here before me. I moved here a year ago to take an energy job in Maine that I was very excited about, and I was wondering if the panelists could discuss legislation that didn't make the topical cut on energy specifically, but might be supporting labor training and moving companies here to Maine to mimic people like me taking the jobs and opportunities that all of these bills are facilitating.
Dan, you want to start with that?
So I think that's a really great question. And I think there's a few things that I would mention. One, a piece of the Climate Council's work will be across the working groups to look at the impact on making sure that there's an equitable transition when it comes to climate change. The governor's executive order, a component of that, directed a few of our offices to have a concerted effort around building the clean energy economy here in Maine, whether that's tracking the jobs to know how we're doing, working with the community college system or the university system to see what programs they have, working with industry to find out what the gaps are. Those are all really things that I think we're excited about and trying to, and want folks in this room and in the energy community to be aware of, is that we'll be working to marshal those efforts together. On the list of a little bit aside that I wanted to mention that we didn't mention is things around offshore wind, and there was legislation to move forward the Maine Aqua Venice project, a 12 megawatt demonstration project, the first floating offshore wind project in the country. And we're excited to see that project move forward, and I think there's a ton of supply chain economic opportunity that comes with that as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Jim, it's 9:55, and we're going to wrap up in a few minutes so that Marty can say his parting words. So hit us with your question.
You're picking on me again.
I always
I'm
pick
gonna
on you.
embarrass
I know you
now.
can take it.
I want that, I hope you brought that $5 you borrowed from me back 2 years ago.
I'm good for
I
it.
don't want any more excuses.
I'm good for it.
My question is based on some simple calculations. If you take a 3/4 per gallon an hour nozzle in an oil furnace, and let's just say you have 500,000 of those, that equates to 15 nuclear power plants, large nuclear power plants. Where do you propose to get that magnitude of energy on a cold winter night, 15 nuclear power plants, if you want to get rid of fossil fuels? And secondly, to Jim, what would that do to the infrastructure of CMP if you ended up putting 15 equivalent nuclear power plants of energy online? It would be far greater than that when you take all the commercial and industrial use and everything, but that's the magnitude. So my question is, where is that energy mix going to come from to displace all this fossil fuel we're going to get off from? Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. You want to start?
I don't know if the energy director wants to take that one, or I'll give it a shot. I think you're right, Jim. I don't think it's possible to displace all the fossil fuel heating that goes on today in Maine. The question is, can it be supplemented so we use somewhat less? Clearly, we're not going to build sufficient generation in the region because there'd be so much excess capacity, both transmission as well as generation, for much of the part of the year if all heating load was switched to electrified sources. But there is a balance there that should be struck so that we can hopefully move away from carbon-intensive heating and onto a decarbonized future that will never quite get there, but we will get a long ways there, hopefully. And that's part of the principle behind, I think, what Dan and his group are doing.
Yeah, and I would just add that if you look at where we've been in the last 20 years or even the last 10 years, we are going through we're at a crossroads. There's this energy systematic change happening right now where 20 years ago we were relying on coal and oil for a large percent of our electricity, and now we're less than 1% for coal and oil. Weren't using as much natural gas for our electricity, now we're heavily dependent on natural gas. So we're seeing these, as Jim mentioned earlier, these retirements of these Eisenhower-age coal plants or these oil plants, and we need to find a way to backfill those. And if we're going to do that, we need to make sure we're doing that in the least emissions way possible to meet our climate change goals.
And I also think what's lost in the conversation a lot is that the real clean air story of natural gas expansion, if you look at the ISO New England website, they'll show you a 14 or 15-year chart of the declines that have occurred because of the fleet changing over to natural gas. The enormous reductions in nitrous oxide and sulfur dioxide are an extraordinarily important clean air story for the region. But really, natural gas has been a bridge fuel that perhaps we're not quite over the bridge, but we're near the end of it, maybe 40 years hence, and so therefore we need the transition now.
We're going to take two more questions. I just want to, as the director of Efficiency Maine, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the amount of energy it takes to heat our homes today is not necessarily the amount that we would require in the future if we could insulate and air seal our homes a little better. We have the leakiest homes in the Northeast. It's been measured. By far, it's not close, okay? We're not like neck and neck. We are head and shoulders worse than everybody else in terms of the leakiness of our homes. And so there's some low-hanging fruit there that still needs to be picked, and we have to keep plugging away at it. We're not going fast enough, frankly. So these things are, luckily we've got a little bit of time to work on it, and I also want to say that I'm really looking forward to this Maine Climate Council and the working groups as an opportunity to do some of the modeling on what Jim is talking about. If you want to, it's fun to play these crystal ball games and imagine what the world's going to look like 30 years from now. But we also need to model out what it would take and what is feasible, what is technically feasible, what is economically feasible, and what is not. And once we have some sense of the magnitude of that, then you can start to look down the list and see where the strategy should go. So I'm sorry for that. Go ahead, sir, and then we'll wrap up with
Thank you. And I just want to say thanks to this panel and E2 Tech for putting this on this morning. It's been a fascinating discussion. My name's Sam Bodek. I'm with a company called Earthshift Global. And one of the things that we focus on is helping companies identify environmental hotspots. You all have identified that transportation is one of Maine's hotspots as far as emissions go. And I think it's great that electrification of the grid and electrification of transportation and finding alternatives is on the agenda and on the docket and in your legislation. Curious to know, we focus mostly on environmental hotspots, but obviously there's a financial hotspot with the gas tax, and electric vehicles not necessarily paying for that. I think it's 30 cents per gallon in Maine, if I'm not mistaken, is what internal combustion engine drivers pay. So are there thoughts, maybe this is a question for you, Dan, on how to replace that revenue to keep the infrastructure up to par? Thanks.
This last session, a Blue Ribbon Commission was established led by the Commissioner of DOT, and they're undertaking a review of long-term financing or considering long-term financing around the state's transportation systems. And so I think that effort combined with the work that's going to happen at the Climate Council will be, that type of conversation is going to be had in those venues. I think it's important to also note that it's vehicle efficiency and diversification is just as important as, it's not just electrification. And the governor signed on to a letter supporting what California is doing related to their fuel efficiency standards and kind of the challenges that they're having with the federal government on that. And so I think, we'll be looking at all those opportunities on those issues.
Thank you.
Thanks. Last question.
Thank you. I'm Megan Shorm with the Sewell Foundation based in Freeport. And I wanted to ask about the opportunity and really the imperative that I think we have as we make this shift in this state, thinking about the environmental impact, but also the social impacts of this work and how, and we know historically the impacts of any type of development have negatively impacted people that have had the least opportunity, the least ability to kind of withstand those stresses, and how you're thinking about and how we make this transition in ways that's really very intentional about minimizing negative impacts and creating opportunity for people who are struggling.
I mean, I think it's important for all of us that are considering legislation or policy to have that objective at the forefront of our mind when we're putting these policies together, not creating a program and then saying, oh, wait, how do we make sure that this impacts everyone? And I think that's what we're trying to do. I think we're trying to learn from what's worked in other states. I think we're trying to implement those policies. Michael mentioned a rebate increase for folks that need it. The solar program, we didn't talk about, the community shared, has a certain percentage that has to go to low and moderate income individuals. I know, Michael, you have a task force at EMT that you're working on, but I think that needs to be at the forefront of the policy conversation in all of these policies and legislation.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to do this, and I'm going to welcome Marty back to the podium to say the closing remarks.
Thank you to our amazing panel led by Michael. Weren't they wonderful? This was just a really phenomenal discussion. I thank you so much. Thank you to everybody that watched on the live stream. Hello out there. That was pretty cool. You've got some good feedback during the panel, and we don't have a mechanism for live stream to ask questions yet, but that would be pretty cool. We could not pull these things off without our sponsors, and I want to make those slides come up again, if I may. I want you to please watch your email because we will be doing a similar review for the the ENR committee coming up in early November. So watch for an email from us. I can't seem to put one of these forums together without running out of coffee. I can promise that we've got fresh coffee waiting for you out there. The parking is free. Just head out of the garage. You don't need a voucher or anything. If you are an E2 Tech member, we have a wonderful list of this legislation that we put on the back of the program if you log in, and it includes links to the PUC dockets. So it's a particularly useful reason to join E2 Tech, which I hope you will all do today. With that, we'll close the panel. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming. We'll see you soon.